First, sorry guys this video took so long. This was supposed to be my video for July, but my computer's been having a fatal issue where it can't type the letter N and sometimes X. This took more than 2 weeks to repair for a variety of reasons, and so this video took much longer than expected. I apologize, and you should expect some more videos to be coming out soon. This is the third in my series of remaking my oldest videos, and we've got my first fantasy video here. Dragons are unbelievably awesome. They can fly, breathe fire, and are massive dinosaur-like lizards. They exist in every mythology on Earth, and are the most popular fantasy creatures, and have populated TV, movies, video games, and books beyond count. Sadly, dragons don't exist. But what if they did? What would the world be like if dragons existed? What would borders be like? What would culture be like? That is the question of this alternate history. I honestly won't make a point of departure here, mainly because it's already been done much better than I ever could by people who know much more about evolution than I do. Trade the Explainer made a video explaining how dragons could have evolved, and the link's in the description. His channel specializes in cryptozoology and evolution, and I recommend you check it out. The content's pretty good. Also, Animal Planet made a documentary on what if dragons existed. You can watch it on YouTube if you want to go through the pain of watching 7-part videos online. It's called Dragons: A Fantasy Made Real. Matt Kaplan also wrote a really incredible book called The Science of Monsters that talks about the science that may have led to our belief in mythical creatures and monsters. It's incredible, and you need to read it if you have any interest in this topic. But for this video, let's assume dragons exist in the way that mythology describes. I'm going to go with traditional mythologies here, and not D&D or Game of Thrones or anything like that. So let's briefly look at the different kinds of dragons we see all over the world. The truth is that almost every human culture has some kind of dragon, but the types vary greatly. I've divided them into roughly 3 categories. The first, large serpents, which are the most common over world cultures. Think the dragons of Greek mythology for this category. Flying serpents, which are slightly less common. Think Quetzalcoatl of Aztec mythology, and the winged lizards. Think the dragons of medieval Europe or their near cousins the wyverns, which are less common. Hydras appear all over the world in areas stretching from Greece to the Congo, but are just too weird with their multiple heads, so I'll ignore them. Basically every culture on Earth has giant serpent myths. Ophidiophobia, or a fancy way of saying the fear of snakes, is one of the most common phobias, so giant snake myths exist in practically every culture. Freud has something to say here about penis symbolism, but I study history so I can be a psycho loner who ignores other people, so this is not going to become a psychology channel. I don't want to draw a map here, simply because it would be useless, since everyone except peoples in really inhospitable climates, like the Inuit, Mongolians, or Lapps have them. Just for a brief overview of the world, in Germanic and Scottish myth, you have the worms, which are nothing like the miserable earth creatures they sound like, but are actually massive snakes that live in ponds. Most of the dragons you hear about in Greek and Roman myth are actually enormous serpents that we've awkwardly shoved into our North European concept of dragon. In early Greek myth, the dragons lived all over the Mediterranean, but the especially famous Ladin lived in the Canary Islands, and a dragon guarded the Golden Fleece in Georgia, where it assumedly had fiddle battles with the devil. As the Romans got a better view of geography, they placed dragons in India and Africa, where they were presumably based off actual massive snakes that lived there. The Islamic world inherited this view of dragons. The Indian dragons were apparently arch-rivals of the elephants, who they fought a permanent war against. Cool side note, the Romans talked about killing a massive serpent in North Africa during the Punic Wars against Carthage. Apparently a Central African python must have made it across the Sahara. In India, we see the Nagas, which are serpent inhabitants of the forest that inhabited India before the Indians. They're kind of like the giants in Norse mythology. Some good, some evil, wise and arcane in general. They're possibly based off the indigenous population of India that the invading Indo-Europeans had to deal with. As Indian civilization spread, we saw the spread of Nagas to Southeast Asia and Indonesia. Snake myths are basically everywhere. South America, Africa, and especially Australia, which has the really cool rainbow serpent god. This is honestly the easiest to make happen. Snakes exist all over the world today, and giant snakes used to exist. 40 million years ago in South America, there was Titan boa, which was a 60-foot-long constrictor. The creature existed in a time after the extinction of the dinosaurs, in which the world temperature was the highest it's been since the ominously titled Great Dying 250 million years ago. Warm-blooded mammals were outcompeted in the thick jungle that covered the world, and the snakes were able to rule. Somehow in this timeline that never happens, and the giant snakes are able to cover most of the world. Snakes already exist all over the world in most climates, and constrictors in our world live surprisingly far north. On a scary note, the Burmese python could theoretically live as far north as Delaware and California in a few decades. However, this doesn't include climates like Scandinavia and Britain, so let's assume that they develop some cold adaptation for the climates involved, maybe more efficient sunning methods to preserve heat. This creates very interesting questions about sea serpents. If massive serpents cover almost all of the land, it makes sense that they'd go into the oceans and become sea monsters. Also, in our world, much of the Indian and Pacific Oceans have sea snakes, just much smaller. However, this is a video entirely unto itself, which I'll probably make at its own point, so let's not get too into this. The next kind of dragon is the flying serpent. We see this in a lot of cultures. The most famous is likely the East Asian dragon. In basically every country that has had any influence from China, like Korea, Japan, or Indonesia, there are records of flying serpent-like dragons. They tend to be a mash of a lot of characteristics, like deer horns or tiger's face, but in general are flying serpents. The Greeks wrote about flying serpents that supposedly lived in Arabia and were in a permanent war against the ibis bird of Egypt, along with the Persian zakak, which are flying serpents. We would be remiss to not mention Quetzalcoatl, the winged serpent of Central American mythology. In European heraldry there is the amphitheater, which is a winged serpent, but I haven't heard any actual legends about it. So this is my general map of the winged serpents. They are concentrated in East Asia, the Middle East, and Central America. Trey the Explainer explains how some snakes are capable of gliding in Southeast Asia. These would be the kind of derivation of this. These dragons wouldn't fly, but would glide over great distances. The final kind is the flying lizard. The most common type of this is the Northern European dragon you're probably familiar with. The dragon most of us know and love comes out of Germanic mythology, like the Anglo-Saxons and Vikings, and spread across Europe with the barbarian invasions. Fire-breathing and dragons is actually mainly limited to Germanic cultures, and only spread to areas like Italy in the 14th century. The Celtic and Slavic dragons aren't that different from the Germanic ones, although they're really badass three-headed Slavic dragons. There's the wyvern that actually wasn't different from dragons in general until the 13th century, but today means two-legged dragon. Outside of Europe, there are actually flying lizards in one of the most unlikely places, Illinois. The native tribes have legends of the Piazza, a very dragon-like creature. The zoo of Sumerian and Jewish mythology is also not dissimilar, but vaguely goes into griffin territory. So the main center of the flying lizard dragon would be Europe and the Middle East, with a side group in the United States, probably hunting the buffalo. So this is the basic map. The giant serpents would dominate most of the world, with the flying lizards and flying snakes dominating their respective regions of the world. I'm just waiting to hear about how I forgot about some obscure Kenyan myth, or how I didn't talk about the Tarrasque turtle dragon of French mythology, or I didn't insert your obscure D&D fanfic. But this is the basic map. Now after that obscenely long start, let's look at how the dragons would affect human history. Firstly, all these dragons would be apex predators in the height of their ecosystems. They would be at the top of their food chains and expect many of them to eat the megafauna like the mammoths. Actually, with the extinction of most of their prey at the end of the last ice age, you would expect the dragons to go extinct. All of the really cool top-of-the-food-chain predators like the saber-tooths and cave bears were driven to extinction 10,000 years ago in our world. However, this would make this timeline really boring, so let's assume that doesn't happen. The dragons merely move from hunting mammoths to deer, and from woolly rhinos to impala. No mythology has humans domesticating dragons like in Aragon or Game of Thrones. This is a creation of the later fantasy genre, and so I won't humor it in this video. Also, we are yet to domesticate a species of reptile, with mammals being the vast majority followed by birds, so dragons remain wild in this world. The primitive humans respect the dragons and in many cases deify them, as they did with many apex predators. Many primitive tribes worship animals like tigers, lions, and bears, oh my, for their strength. The dragons would be no different. As mankind would advance and control more of its environment, it would learn to detest the dragons that would burn its fields and eat its sheep. In this way, wolves and snakes moved from a fellow competing species to hated instruments of Satan. This is in some cases at least. In many cultures, dragons are worshipped. It tends to be irrigation societies, where the peasants are dependent on both a deeply impersonal massive government for maintenance of their irrigation canals, and the flowing of the rivers for their crops. In this sense of powerlessness, the peasants tend to worship massive, powerful forces of nature, instead of trying to defeat them. Thus, the Mesopotamians deified their dragon Tiamat as an evil goddess of salt water. Meanwhile, the Chinese worship the dragons as exceptional divine forces, and the Mexican kingdoms worship Quetzalcoatl. The Nagas are protective spirits in India. This would also happen in this timeline. A love-hate relationship would be established with the dragons. They would be worshipped for their strength, and thus sometimes given divine preference, but also would be killed if they infringed upon farmland too much. These would be considered evil dragons, while the good dragons stayed out in the wilderness where they could be appreciated at a distance. In general, the dragons would be just another apex predator, just even more apex. As human technology would improve, the dragons would slowly be driven into the periphery. In the ancient world, lions used to live in Greece and southern France, and tigers could be seen as far west as the Ukraine. But as civilizations advanced and their habitats were destroyed, the apex predators were driven into smaller and smaller areas. No matter the hide and fire of dragons, they wouldn't be able to defeat millions of humans with intelligent steel and guns. The European dragons would be driven into the Scandinavia, the Caucasus, and Russia, much like the wolf and the bear. The East Asian and Mexican dragons, being worshipped as gods, would be given some special preference, and would be given reservations, and survive in diminished, albeit healthier numbers. The giant serpents would have a much better run. I can think of almost no case in which pythons, snakes, or the like have been successfully driven back. Their range today is practically what it was at the dawn of history. Of course, these pythons would be massive, making them more reliant upon their habitats for food and easier for humans to kill, but still messing with snakes is tough. We'd have to wait until rifles would be invented to do this well. The alligator was almost driven to extinction in our world in the early 20th century in America, and so we can expect a similar effect. However, much of the Third World, the giant serpents would thrive much as they had without the government initiative to nearly wipe them out. In the Americas, the extinction of the dragons would take longer to take place. However, the Spanish would view the flying and giant serpents as tools of Satan, and would correlate them with the native religions that would worship them. Thus, expect the Spanish to try to carry out extermination attempts against them. The Americans would likely exterminate the Great Plains dragons due to it eating American cattle, and the genocide against the buffalo would do a great deal of weakening the American dragons' numbers. Similar to the wolf, which was exterminated in America, and the cougar, which was pushed into the far reaches of Florida and the Rockies. In the early 20th century, however, expect the environmentalist movement to kick in. People started to feel guilty about killing animals. As man gained such a predominance in its environment, it wanted to preserve what was left of the animal world. This was worldwide and saw the revitalization of numbers of apex predators. At this point, the European dragon, Chinese, and Mexican dragon would be surviving in far-off mountains and hidden regions, while the American dragon would be driven to extinction. The giant serpents would be spread thinly, but everywhere. The restoration of dragon numbers would start. This would be helped by the intelligence of dragons, which is true in almost all non-giant serpent myths, and would thus create more empathy for them. The region where dragon numbers would still be collapsing is the Third World, which is none of the First and Second World's qualms about nature because they're still too poor to feel guilty. Habitat destruction and illegal trade to the First and Second Worlds would result in continual attrition in the Third World. This is similar to how many endangered African animals are killed to satisfy China's lust for medicine. However, the Third World would mainly be inhabited by the giant serpent type of dragon that wouldn't exactly be rare across the Earth. What if Alt Hist? Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed that video, please comment, subscribe, and support me on Patreon. And as always, thank you for watching and have a good day.